Today, as the 2024 election approaches, we will take a look at what time the polls close in each state. Not only could this be useful for voters in the 50 states plus Washington, D.C., but this could be helpful to those of you who are going to be planning your nights around the election. No judgment from me, I'm obviously going to be doing it too. All times here on these next handful of slides will be Eastern Time. At 5:59 p.m., we'll call this the calm before the storm. Polls everywhere in the United States will be open, excluding some of the territories. The night begins at 6 p.m. Eastern, when the first polls of election 2024 close in the Eastern Time Zone portions of Kentucky and Indiana. You will start to see the first results trickle across your screen in the 6 p.m. Eastern hour, but don't expect to see any states called, as parts of those two states will still be voting. It won't be until 7 p.m. Eastern that you will see your first calls, with the rest of Indiana and Kentucky joining Vermont, Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, and the majority of Florida. So, our first critical state, Georgia, closes at 7 p.m., but most of this map is still dark. At 7 p.m., we're starting to get some votes in, and maybe some races called, but we're not at the big prizes just yet. However, the next closings are not at 8 p.m. Eastern, but at 7:30. 3 states, North Carolina, Ohio, and West Virginia, will close their polling stations and start counting. At this point, 10 states, in whole or in part, will have their polls closed, but expect that to change in a big way in the 8 p.m. hour. 8 p.m. Eastern might be the busiest hour of the night as things really start to take off. 20 states plus Washington, D.C. will fully or partially close their polls. At this point, the polls will have closed in a majority of states, at least for most voters. Some parts of Texas, Michigan, Kansas, and South Dakota will still be open, but aside from that, you have the whole East Coast except for New York, and we will start to cut into the heartland. Again, there is a half-hour closing to break up the main action. At 8:30 p.m. Eastern, Arkansas will be the only state to close its polls. One would imagine calls will be made there shortly thereafter. Then at 9 p.m. Eastern, things intensify yet again with a handful more states closing. By this point, all but 10 states will have closed their polls, so results are going to start showing up fast and furious in the 9 p.m. hour. Some of the key East Coast races might be in a position to be called at this point prior to 10 p.m., but really we have no idea what kind of night we're in for, so that will have to wait. At 10 p.m. Eastern, we start penetrating closer to the Pacific Coast, but with only a handful of states closing their polls, including just 3 full states. Doubtful that we will know anything substantial in the 10 p.m. hour about key races in these new states, like the Montana or Nevada Senate races. Those calls may come much later in the night, if not Wednesday or subsequent days. The lower 48 will be completely filled in by 11 p.m. Eastern, as the polls closed in Washington, California, and the remainder of a few other partially closed states. By this point, we're T plus 5 hours from the first poll closings and 3 hours ahead of the closings in most states out east. There are going to be races getting called all over the place in the 11 p.m. hour, but as for where they are and what they mean, we'll find out together on November 5th. After this, the poll closings move to the non-contiguous states. At midnight Eastern, Wednesday morning, the polls close in most of Alaska and Hawaii. Note how I said most of Alaska because there is a portion of the state in the Hawaii-Aleutian time zone, and those polls close at 1 a.m. Eastern. So it took 7 hours, but that's the map of the poll closings across America on election night. Arranging this another way, here are the poll closings by state as shown in the local time. Keep in mind a couple of things. These are the scheduled poll closing times as of now. If there are issues on the state or local level on election day, some locales may keep theirs open longer. Obviously, this is nothing that we can account for now. Please also check with your local or state election board for updated information and leave yourself enough time to vote. Finally, if you are in line when the polls close, stay in line and you should be able to vote. They won't let new people into the line, but they will let everyone vote who was there at that point. Anyway, pause the video if you need more time to look. I won't be upset, and also I wouldn't know. Some states here, like Alaska and Indiana, span multiple time zones, and when we list both time zones but at the same time, this means the polls close an hour apart from each other. Most of Florida closes at 7 p.m. Eastern, but the Panhandle is at 7 p.m. Central, which is of course 8 p.m. Eastern. However, there are some states which span multiple time zones, but see their state all close at the same time. Nebraska is one of those states, where voters in some of those western counties will have to get to the polls a little earlier, as theirs close at 7 p.m. local time, while the rest of the state gets to vote until 8 p.m. Otherwise, you will see that 8 p.m. local time is a very common closing time. This continues with our last slide, and again, Tennessee is a state that closes all its polls together, despite the fact that it's split between Eastern and Central. Texas is one of those that does not, but the only part of Texas not in the Central time zone is the far western part of the state, which includes El Paso. In the vast majority of states, if you assume your polls will be open until 7 or 8 p.m. local time, you will probably be correct. Opening times can widely vary depending on where you are, but closing times are fairly uniform. As mentioned before, the march of the poll closings from east to west will take 7 hours, starting at 6 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday, and with all polls closed by 1 a.m. Wednesday Eastern Time. The heavy hours you need to see will be the 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. hours, when a hefty majority of states will see their polls close. In that 2-hour span, you'll go from 10 states fully or partially closed to 40. For more on election 2024 and U.S. elections, it's electionyard.com. Where else?